really are very honored. We have an extraordinary gathering here today. People have come, very illustrious people have come from across the country, from across the spectrum of perspectives to have this conversation. It means a whole lot that you have come, as I know that this means a lot to you personally, and I know that it means a lot to you as Premier of this province as well. It's really, really important, and we're thrilled to have you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, the Premier of Ontario.
Thank you, Rima. Thank you very much. Thank you so much. Well, thank you, Rima. Thank you very, very much, and good afternoon, everyone. Bonjour, bonjour, Ani, Sego, Segoli. Thank you very much for having me here, and I'm very excited to be at Couchiching at Geneva Park to have this opportunity to talk with all of you, and I'm happy to be here, gathered on the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe peoples. And I want to just say that to me, Geneva Park has a whole lot of meanings. I was here, it has to be 46 years ago as a kid. I know, and the dock looks the same. It must have been replaced. It must have been replaced many, many times, but it's in the same position. And then I came, 25, 30 years ago with my children because someone would cook for me, and that was a good thing. But I want to thank you for allowing me to be here. I want to recognize the long history of First Nations and Métis and Inuit people in Ontario and show them respect today. And I want to echo what Rima said, that this is a conversation that should have happened a long time ago, and we need to acknowledge where this conversation needs to go. And so I'm glad to be part of it. So I've got some formal remarks that I'm going to make, and then I look forward to the interaction that we can have. So when I opened my remarks, I acknowledged the territory, and I'm in most of my events, my public events, I'm doing that, whether it's at my swearing in at Queen's Park or making a transit announcement in Ottawa. I try to make a point of acknowledging the traditional territory on which we're gathering. And when I first started doing it, there was a bit of, why is she doing that? That's just making me nervous. Why is she doing that? And some of my staff early on, do you have to do that? And it's been mentioned in the press that I do this, and I'm not quite sure that everyone gets why I'm doing it, and so I just want to talk a little bit about that, because some people have speculated that it's because my two granddaughters, Olivia and Claire, are First Nations. Their dad is Cree. His family's from Attawapiskat and from Chisasibi in Quebec. Or some chalk it up to the fact that I was Minister of Aboriginal Affairs in the time before I became Premier. And those things are true. Those things are very true. But it's more than that from my perspective. It's because I really deeply believe that any kind of collaborative, respectful relationship is the infrastructure that underlies the foundation of good policy. Unless we have good relationships, then we can't develop good policy. So that is what I want to talk about today, and I hope that we'll be able to have some conversation about that. So I want to talk about what I'm trying to do as Premier, and I'll go back to my time as Minister of Aboriginal Affairs, Minister of Education, and before, to talk about what I have tried to do and then what we are trying to do as a government. But I believe that we can't create jobs if we don't understand people's aspirations, and we can't connect communities if we're not aware of their needs and priorities. It won't work. And we can't support people in their lives if we don't know what their challenges are and their culture and history. And in this case, in this conversation, our own history, our own past. And that's I think what we haven't fully understood, that we've said, it's about somebody else's past. It's not. It's about a shared relationship that has either been non-existent, dysfunctional, or in some cases, somewhat better. So we need to build that respect. We need to have trust, and we need to have a level of understanding that allows everyone to feel that we're working towards the same goals, or that we at least understand the goals that we're each aspiring to, and that we're on the same playing field. And that needs to be real. So it's not that just people that just feel that, it's that it's actually real. My sense of there being a disconnect in this whole discussion goes back to when I was quite young. So it goes back to 1978, 79, which was the first time that I had two experiences that raised for me some of the concerns around how we've treated each other in this area. So in 1978, I was finishing my master's degree in linguistics, and I volunteered with the Federal Department of Indian Affairs at that point, and did a language survey on Constance Lake Reserve north of Hearst. And I was woefully unprepared to do that. But I was sent there, and I spent time, and people were very gracious as I asked really stupid questions. But out of that, I got a sense of how kids were coming off the Constance Lake Reserve into Hearst to go to school, and the teachers had such low expectations of those kids and talked about their English as being substandard. And I knew from my own work that these kids were speaking perfectly good English. It was just a different English. It was a non-standard English, and it was because their families spoke Ojibwe and Cree and Ojibwe, and these kids were speaking a different dialect of English, basically. And so it led me to this sense of, okay, something's really wrong here, because these kids are coming into this school in town, and they are being treated in a way that means that they have no high expectations to live up to. My second experience was the next summer. I went to Goose Bay, Labrador, and I was working for Memorial University and teaching ESL with people of the Naskapi Nation. And it was one of those situations where the goals of the university and the program that people were enrolled in were completely at odds with the students. And so out of those experiences, I had this kind of nascent sense that there is so much that we have to do, and how are these bad decisions being made? And then there were many, many intervening years. But what I want to talk about is, since I've been in government and what we're doing now, what have we been able to do, or what do we need to do to build that relationship infrastructure? So I was elected in 2003 and became the parliamentary assistant to the Minister of Training Colleges and Universities. And so I'm new to government. We're just finding our way and trying to figure out, where are the paths forward. And I was undertaking a report on adult education. And I met with a group of Aboriginal education advocates so that I could understand the needs of their communities. This is less than 10 years ago, but at that point, that group of leaders that I left with had only been engaged in kind of one-off conversations, one-off consultations. There was no sense that they were part of the fabric of what government was doing, or that there was any kind of systematic way of them engaging. And so, I think that led to a sense that there really isn't a lot of optimism. There wasn't a lot of optimism for making change, because there wasn't a systematic way of engaging. And I tell you that because I think it's important to illustrate that in many instances, we're building that relationship from scratch as government to community, and putting that systematic process in place is really important. So in 2006, when I was named Minister of Education, I took over the portfolio. We didn't have a comprehensive Aboriginal education policy, and the Ministry of Education didn't have dedicated employees the dedicated employees that were necessary to build the conditions to be able to put such a policy in place, or to understand what it needed to be. So while I was there, we worked to initiate consultations that produced our government's First Nation, Métis, and Inuit education policy. There were people thinking about it in the ministry, but we got there, and so I oversaw the creation of the Aboriginal Education Office. I was headed by a First Nations educator and formed the basis for some sustained ongoing leadership on this file. I'm not suggesting that is all that needs to be done. I'm just saying that some of the systematic approaches are pretty new. So that framework was introduced in 2007. That's just 6 years ago. And that's how recently government has been establishing some of these connections. So in order for us to continue to make some progress, we've had to look across government. So when I was Minister of Transportation, I realized that there was nobody, even though we're built, think about what the Ministry of Transportation does. The Ministry of Transportation builds roads all over the province or expands roads, and so really connects with communities everywhere. But there was nobody in the Ministry of Transportation whose role it was to make sure that there were good facilitated discussions with the people whose communities we were building roads through and around in all parts of the province, particularly First Nation and Métis people. So as Minister of Transportation, I brought in someone and a First Nations person who then became a connector across the ministry and across ministries. So those are some of the things that I think we've had to do. The creation of the Ministry of Aboriginal Affairs was, in the first instance, when we came to government, Premier McGuinty made it a priority to put in place a standalone Ministry of Aboriginal Affairs, and it really is about connecting across ministries. And an example of that is the guidelines for resource revenue sharing. That all of the ministries understand what the expectations are in terms of resource revenue sharing and how we need to engage, and the whole issue around duty to consult, that across government there's an understanding of that as a priority and as an obligation. So those are things that we have been doing in order to attempt to put some of those systematic approaches in place. When I was Minister of Aboriginal Affairs, and with the history that I'd had in education, I really wanted to make education a priority, because I think, and it's a bias of my background, but I really believe that if we can find ways, and I know that you've had some of this conversation, if we can find ways to do two things. First of all, improve the education of Aboriginal kids around the province, across the country really, and help more of those kids to get the education that they need, to graduate from high school, to help them on a path to do whatever it is they want to do. And as one kid from Treaty 3 said to me, we don't all want to be miners. I get that. Let them do what they want to do, but we need to support them in getting that education. And secondly, if we can move to better education about our history in our schools, mandatory education about things like the residential school experience, mandatory Aboriginal education across the curriculum, so when you start in kindergarten, you learn history in a different way than we have, then if we can do those two things, then the relationship will change, economic opportunity will change, the view of how to relate to government will change. All of that will change if we can get those education pieces right. And so that is my goal in terms of our relationship with Aboriginal people in Ontario. And as Minister of Aboriginal Affairs, there were a number of issues like housing, like healthcare, like infrastructure, all of which bump up against the federal government, and you all know that it's very easy to get caught in jurisdictional tangles when it comes to whose responsibility is what. my attitude has been in each one of my ministries that at a point we will bump into the federal responsibilities. But my responsibility is to do everything in my power as the Premier or the Minister in the Ontario government to move the bar forward, to change the way we relate, to change the outcomes for kids particularly, but for Aboriginal people, and deal with the federal government as we go along. So I'll give you, if we talk about education, there's a lot of pressure when you're Minister of Education or Minister of Aboriginal Affairs not to get into a situation where you're taking on the federal government's responsibilities, because that's the federal government's responsibility and we don't want to have to pay for something that the federal government is supposed to pay for. I get that, but I believe in shaming. So I believe, I just do. Because if we can demonstrate that there's the possibility to make a difference, and we can step up to the plate and say, this is what we think needs to happen, and here's the plan for it, and we actually have created the table, and here we are, the Aboriginal people and the provincial government sitting at the table, federal government, where are you? I think that's a powerful thing to do. I think that that is the kind of process that actually brings people. And I'm not talking about being aggressively hostile. I'm not talking about that. Although one can do that. One can do that, but that is not the way I think we get action. I think what we have to do is make it very clear what we believe in, what we stand for, and bring a solution, bring an opportunity. So if I think about on-reserve education, from my perspective, the way we're going to get better on-reserve education is for all the resources of the provincial government and all the knowledge and expertise of First Nations people in the communities and all the money of the federal government to be able to work together to find a new model. Because it's not about the provincial government taking over from the federal government. That's not what it's about. It's about creating a new model, a new kind of education. The fact is, we've got resources as a provincial government, and I know you've heard from the wonderful Paul Martin this morning about the work that he's doing, and there are wonderful resources that we have as a provincial government, but they need to be used in different ways if we're going to find different ways of working with kids in on reserve and off reserve. And remember, kids who start their education on reserve, most of those kids come off reserve into provincial schools. So I'm working back now. My Minister of Education and Minister of Aboriginal Affairs have a mandate to figure out how to fix those transitions. What can we do as a provincial government to make sure that as kids come off reserve into provincial schools, that they don't fall through the cracks when they come into the provincial high schools, because we've got that responsibility. So it's irresponsible of us to say, oh, well, they didn't get the education that they needed on reserve, so that's why they're falling through the cracks in the high school, so we just wash our hands of it. Nonsense. We've got to figure out how to support those kids as they're in the provincial high school, but how can we support their teachers and their principals on reserve so that they can help those kids get ready? When I was Minister of Aboriginal Affairs and I visited Pekanjikam, and I realized that the principal, many of her teachers weren't there because the buildings the teachers lived in had mold and they'd had to leave. And this principal really had no peer group. She had nobody to talk to. She really didn't have a group of educators or a group of peers on whom she could draw for support. So we've got, as I said, 5,000 provincial schools. All of those schools have a principal. Why can't we provide some support for those educators on reserve? So that's the kind of work that we have to do. And we'll deal with the jurisdictional issues, and we'll push each other. And that I think that the form will follow the intention. That if we have the right intention and we are solving for the issues that are real, then we'll bring everyone along with us. And we had an example of that at the Council of the Federation, meeting with the other premiers across the country, and we were talking about calling on the national Aboriginal organizations were calling on the federal government to put in place a national inquiry, as you know, and we found consensus around the table among the premiers, some who were reluctant, but we found consensus on supporting the national Aboriginal organizations in that. And so, you know, that kind of, let's come along, let's support, let's build that trusting relationship. I think that creates momentum. And I know the federal government has said they're not going to do it. But again, I think that we as provinces have to do what we can to be ready when the federal government decides it is going to do something. So we need to make sure that we have our statistics. We understand what our situations are so that we can feed into a process. It's about that being ready and solving what we can. So I want to understand better how we can play a bigger role as a provincial government, how we can make sure that we are being collaborative, that we're understanding what the factors are, and that we bring the right people to the table. You know, I think that in terms of those relationships, we are in a better place. I'm not suggesting that we're there, but at least now we can look at pilot programs. We can think about new improved targets for student achievement, for example. We couldn't even have talked about those things in 2007 because we didn't have any of the relationship infrastructure. But now we are talking with the people who are most affected, and we're finding ways of working together. And whether that's on economic development, because there are lots of challenges, and you know, issues like tobacco, and how do we create together economies that are legitimate, that are good for the kids and the families living in community, as well as the rest of the province. We can at least have those conversations now. I am nowhere in this speech because I've just left it. I just left it behind. But I'm just checking to see if there's anything I was supposed to say that I didn't say. But we're putting in place an Ontario youth job strategy, and as part of that job strategy, we're focusing on some of the groups who we know are most challenged and have been most challenged because of their history, because of their circumstances, and one of those is Aboriginal kids. When we talk about the Ring of Fire and developing that chromite deposit and all of those minerals in Northern Ontario, I have, since I was the Minister of Aboriginal Affairs, I've made the point that we're not going to take anything out of the ground in the Ring of Fire unless those relationships are in place, unless those memoranda of understanding and those connections with the communities of the Matawa communities are in place. And so the fact that we have got now an interlocutor that Frank Iacobucci is going to be working with Bob Ray, and they're going to be working out how we can come to agreements that are going to allow us to move forward, I think is a great step forward. And it has to do with the economic development, but it also has to do with the social supports. It has to do with the health supports and the training supports, because as I discovered when I flew into Webequie over a year ago, which Webequie is one of the First Nations close to the Ring of Fire, you know, we were talking about training, and we were talking about heavy equipment and what kind of training opportunities would be available, but we couldn't talk about any of that until we talked about substance abuse and helping people to get off OxyContin so that they could actually take part in a training program. So the multi-layered nature of the supports that have to be in place, I think, are really important for us to remember as government, and those respectful approaches to those solutions is what is going to allow us to move ahead. So I'm thrilled to be in this role, as much because I get to put into practice the knowledge and the experience that I've gleaned over my however many, 59, 60 years. And on this file, there's so much left to do, and I really appreciate that the people in this room are committed to, A, having the conversation, but then I hope each one of you, and I don't know all of you, but I can tell you that to this day, I still have never knocked on a door anywhere in Ontario and had anyone say, so what are you doing about the plight of Aboriginal people in Ontario? It just does not come up. So where you live, you need to go back and, if you are in a place where this doesn't get talked about, and I know some of you, in your churches, in your communities, we need to raise this. And that's why I do the greetings. That's why I talk about the traditional territory, because I want people to say, well, that was a weird thing she said. Why did she say that? She's just weird. And then we go from weird to, okay, that's why she said it. And then we have a better understanding. So it's the beginning of that very important conversation that Rima talked about. Thank you very much, Miigwech.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful.